Okay, welcome back. And we are now moving into the disarmament section of the Peace Camp. So next, I will be giving the reins over to Taylor Douglas, who will be giving a brief rundown of the UN goals for disarmament, Canada's road to disarmament, and the intersection of disarmament with feminist foreign policy. She will also give updates on VOW's disarmament campaign and goals for the future. So Taylor is in her final year at McGill University, working towards a joint honors degree in political science and gender, sexuality, feminist, and social justice studies. Her interests include ecofeminism, migrant justice, feminist economics, and the care economy, and other forms of intersectional feminist research that seek to transform global systems of oppression to create a more just and empathetic world. She is a 2021 intern at the Consortium for Gender Security and Human Rights, headed by Dr. Carol Cohn, and her work with VOW and disarmament fits in perfectly with her interest in sustainable and intersectional feminist peace. So Taylor, welcome, and thanks for speaking to us today about the current campaign. I'll hand it over to you now.
No problem. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. So today I'm just going to give a brief overview of our disarmament agenda and kind of how we see disarmament going forward in Canada, as well as just where our campaign's at and where we're planning on going with the Elect Peace campaign. So disarmament is the act of reducing, limiting, or abolishing weapons. I'm sure you all have a pretty good idea, but I'll just kind of set a baseline here. So as we have in this lovely graphic made by our former disarmament campaigner, disarmament courageously creates the space for reimagining the concept of security and re-envisioning the role of the state. It can also liberate international relations from the threat and use of armed force. So disarmament relies more so on nonviolent practices, conflict prevention, diplomacy, and mediation. So basically where we're at right now is setting out our agenda for disarmament. So VOW Peace is calling for the federal government to heed Secretary General Guterres' appeal and develop a national agenda for disarmament, since we have none. We're also calling for a comprehensive study that includes public consultations across the country, expert witnesses, a report, and recommendations on disarmament. We're also calling for the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade to conduct this study and include public consultations. And so we started with a civil society discussion that we had in June 2021. And so there's a document that was created by the former campaigner in my role that kind of took all of the thoughts from that civil society meeting and brought them together so we can kind of come up with a more palpable goals for our own campaign and for what like other peace campaigns can be focused on when we're pushing Canada for disarmament. So these are the 4 pillars of the UN disarmament campaign. It's disarmament that saves humanity, disarmament that saves lives, disarmament for future generations, and strengthening partnerships for disarmament. And so this is a rather long document that I will attach at the end, but it basically just gives a rundown on disarmament, the UN disarmament goals, and then our specific goals that we decided at the civil society meeting. So these are our specific priorities, and these are our disarmament priorities for Canada, including the National Action Plan. A part that I would love to talk about is also the feminist foreign policy aspect of this. So Canada has committed to creating a feminist foreign policy and promised to release a paper explaining and detailing the goals of that at the end of 2020. Obviously, that never happened. So it's kind of just been a process of Canada using these feminist foreign policy buzzwords, yet not coming up with any palpable action or plan or anything that really details how any of our foreign policy is feminist. And yet we have a full national defense policy that is, people are putting work into. So basically we're pushing for Canada to stick to its promises and actually create this plan. Sweden, which was the first country to adopt feminist foreign policy, has an extensive handbook on their policy principles. And so we're basically just pushing Canada to keep up and not just use this facade of kind of feminist foreign policy to justify further militarism, as we see with the No Fighter Jets campaign and like the warships campaign. Canada is not doing the most feminist things with their foreign policy. What else do I have here? So this is our Elect Peace campaign. that we've been starting. I know Lane touched on this. So basically for this campaign, we've created a bunch of resources that people can use when talking to their candidates that push our goals. Obviously, we'd like Canada to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So ICAN really pushes for this. And I know that I think in Canada, Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto have all municipally signed on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but Canada has yet to. We are looking to reduce military spending, and we are looking to develop a palpable national agenda on disarmament. So this is our fact sheet. I would push anyone who is unsure how to talk to their candidates about disarmament to take a look at this. It basically sets out our issue, the risk of nuclear weapons being at its highest since the Cold War, and basically just the fact that nuclear weapons today are far more destructive than they ever were before. So these are our questions to ask your candidates that we've set out. I really hope someone else uses this. I had a good time making it, and I am excited to use it when talking to my candidates. So this is just another graphic for our Elect Peace campaign. And we are about to start our session with Allison. We had our first Drinks and Disarmament earlier in July, which was a lovely conversation with a bunch of different people on basically how can we achieve disarmament? How can we achieve sustainable feminist peace? And how can all of these different pieces of like the care economy and pandemic recovery and like racial justice come together to create a more intersectional disarmament based kind of, a lot of our conversation, was basically trying to figure out how we could combine like pushes to defund the police with like demilitarization, and how we can like connect these issues that people already care about and make them realize that they're all kind of pushing for the same thing. So I'm really excited to hear from all of you and from Allison in our following session. And the last thing I have for you today is, this is actually, it just came across my desk in the last week, but the NGO Women, Peace and Security Civil Society open letter. I'm gonna just put the link in to the chat, but right now it's basically the Women, Peace and Security NGO group is pushing the UN and member states to support women human rights defenders, peace builders, and civil society leaders, and kind of step up and do better to protect them. So slightly unrelated to VOW, but if you had time to sign onto this and take a look, it's a really great letter. And I think that's me. Our Elect Peace campaign tools will come out soon, and I hope you get to use them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Taylor, for that rundown of the VOW Peace Disarmament campaign. We are currently working on our Elect Peace toolkit. You saw a few graphics that Taylor has made, and we are hoping to fill out even more on different peace issues. So we are looking for help on that. If you are interested, please get in touch. I'll put my email in the chat, and we can talk if you'd like to contribute, if you'd like to get the information. The links will be available soon. So we are a few minutes ahead of schedule, but I do see that Allison has joined us, which is wonderful. And I'm wondering if we can start a few minutes early on your session. That sound good? Okay, great. So I will do a quick introduction of Allison, and we'll get right into her session, which will provide an overview of key disarmament challenges and solutions from a feminist and gendered perspective. So through examples and stories, it will explain the role and highlight the contributions of civil society in this work. And we are so lucky to have Allison with us today. She is the program consultant for Reaching Critical Will. She contributes to the organization's monitoring and analysis of disarmament processes, as well as its research and other publications, as well as liaises with the UN, government, and civil society colleagues. So prior to this role, Allison worked in policy and advocacy with the Control Arms Coalition, focusing on the Arms Trade Treaty. She has also worked with Religions for Peace and Minds Action Canada on a broader range of arms issues and has significant experience in campaigning and advocacy, research and writing, project management, and multilateral treaty negotiations. Alison has a BA in International Relations from the University of Toronto and an MA in International Relations from the City University of New York. She is an expert with the Forum on the Arms Trade and a 2018 UN Women Metro New York Champion of Change. So welcome, Alison. We're so happy to have you here.
Hello, everybody. It's always like funny when you hear your own biography being read out. So thanks very much for that, and thank you for including me in your journey today. You've probably had a long day and have been taking in a lot of information. So I'll do what I can to make this peppy and interesting. Although, of course, disarmament is a rather heavy topic. So I'll see what I can do. I wanted to just, before I begin though, just jump in quickly on what you were just saying about the election and some of the resources that you were sharing. I know that Minds Action Canada, based in Ottawa, they do a survey of all the different parties and they invite all the leaders to respond to a series of questions about their positions around different weapons issues. And I don't think that they've yet had many responses, but when they do, they'll be posting them online. So it can be a helpful resource maybe in finalizing your own resources and in the work going forward. So I just wanted to share that. So basically, I will be trying to cover two things in my presentation. First is just to kind of break down a little bit, what do we mean when we say disarmament? Is it the same as arms control? Who are some of the key players in this work? What does it look like practically speaking as well? And then also to talk a little bit more about disarmament from a feminist perspective, what it looks like when you bring a gender analysis into this work. And I'll do that by sort of highlighting and giving examples of different activities that we do at WILPF. I should maybe just clarify that Reaching Critical Will is the name of WILPF's disarmament program. Sometimes people think it's a distinct organization because it does have such a strong brand of its own, but we're part of the big WILPF machine. I don't know, I think Taylor, you had kindly agreed to show my slides. Is that still okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely, let me pull them up.
No problem, thank you. Well, maybe just to get going in the meantime, so what I wanted to just start out was by explaining, Taylor just did a great job at defining and breaking down what disarmament means and what it looks like. I think it's helpful to also have two other words in mind. One is non-proliferation, which is about not letting weapons be acquired by other actors. It's about stopping the spread of weapons. And the emphasis there is less about destruction and less about actually disarming, but just preventing the proliferation of weapons. And then arms control is sort of a third category of actions and policies that is about controlling weapons. Arms control doesn't necessarily seek to reduce or diminish what weapons are already out there, but rather to control for their use, stockpiling, transfer, etc. Yeah, I think it's the second slide that has this on it.
Yes, sorry, I'm just trying not to scroll down.
No problem.
Terrible way to do it.
That's why I don't like to do it, because I'm also speaking and looking at my notes. I just get myself confused. But anyway, the reason why I wanted to mention these three terms is that certainly for WILPF, and I would imagine for Val and many of you on this call, disarmament and the abolition of weapons is the primary goal and the primary objective. But often these things work together within single treaties or within single policies. So for example, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is about stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But within that, there is also a disarmament commitment for the countries that already have nuclear weapons. So sometimes these three things sort of work together. Next slide, please. Great. Okay. So I thought I would just outline, what kinds of weapons are out there and how are they organized and how are they understood. And I think that this is important because different of these weapons have different diplomatic processes tied to them, different, I think, histories of work that has been done on them and different approaches as well. So one big category that you probably know are weapons of mass destruction, WMD, and that includes nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons. And then conventional arms are things like landmines, cluster munitions, other kinds of explosives. It also includes small arms and light weapons, which is sort of a subcategory of conventional arms. Things like missile launchers. At the moment, drones kind of fall under conventional arms categories as well, but I guess that could change. A third way of organizing this is to sort of talk about the emerging, and I put that in quotes because some of this technology is no longer emerging, it's here, but especially in the United Nations context, we're still applying this label of emerging to it, even though it's long since been there. And under that category, I would put things like autonomous weapons or killer robots. The broader role of AI in weapons across the board, and cybersecurity. And I think it's also good to keep in mind ammunition, because if there was no ammunition, then the guns and other weapons would certainly be a lot less easily used. But sometimes we forget about that when we're just talking about the weapon itself. There's also a category of things called less lethal weapons, strange name, I know, and these are things like rubber bullets, wax bullets, beanbag rounds, things that maybe are used more in policing efforts, but can still have a lot of harm. And there's increasingly, I think, especially with a lot of the recent police violence, more discussion about less lethal weapons and their control. And then finally, I wanted to just mention military equipment as well, for two reasons. One, because I think it's part of the whole militarism problem that we're wanting to address when we address disarmament, right? And there are things like certain kinds of vehicles or certain kinds of aircraft, battleships, et cetera, that are addressed by instruments like the Arms Trade Treaty, but that are maybe sometimes we don't think about them in weapons in the same way that we think about a gun, for example. And then I also wanted to mention parts and components, and this category as a whole, because something that I've really become very aware at in the time that I've been living back in Canada is that quite a lot of Canadian arms production and its trade and transfers are in the area of vehicles or in parts and components that go into things that other countries assemble into weapons. And I think because these are maybe less immediately harmful looking, or maybe they're a little bit harder to trace down the line and identify what their future use is, it can be a little bit easier to lose sight of them and to think that they're harmless, but they're actually not. Next slide, please. Okay, so talking now about approaches. I've thrown out a couple of things here on this slide. I think there are legal ways to address weapons issues, to address disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. Within the legal category, we would see treaties and agreements. Some major ones to mention here would be the Mine Ban Treaty or the Ottawa Convention that bans landmines, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Arms Trade Treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. There's also a treaty that bans chemical weapons and also a treaty that bans biological weapons. And then I also made a category of political, because there are sometimes and on some issues, political declarations, binding instruments that are not legal in the way that a treaty is, but that try to help address some of the harms caused by weapons. So for example, there is a UN program of action on small arms and light weapons. And the objective of the POA, as it's called by its acronym, is to prevent human harm and eradicate the trafficking in illicit small arms and light weapons. And it reads almost like a treaty, but it's not actually legally binding on states, it's politically binding on states. Right now, there is a process underway to get a political declaration to stop the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. So this would be another example of maybe more political instruments rather than legal ones. And then also very important within disarmament is the technical work of actually disarming and getting rid of weapons. Things like this would include demining and clearance operations, DDR, which is disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And then finally, stockpile management could be another example of this. And then I did put a category on as other. I think there may be increasingly what we're seeing too a little bit in the area of cybersecurity and some of these emerging technological fields that relate to weapons, is there aren't yet big multilateral or even regional instruments to govern their use. But there is a lot of emerging national and regional policy and practice or technical standards that are being applied. Next slide, please. Okay, so who's doing what in the disarmament world? So there's a whole list of different actors that I just thought I'd put up here. Of course, national governments are very important in this work, but also local governments are as well. I think, Taylor, that you mentioned the city's appeal, and this is a great example of how local municipalities can take action against a weapons issue. There are also regional and intergovernmental bodies who sometimes introduce their own activities and approaches. The African Union has for many years been working on something called a Silencing the Guns initiative as an example of that. And then treaty bodies are also very important actors in all of this work. So some treaties, when they are negotiated, they will set up a technical secretariat or some other kind of body to help coordinate the work of treaty implementation and universalization. So they can often be big and important actors in this space. And then of course are the militaries themselves. Peacekeeping operations sometimes have disarmament related operations or components of their mission. The United Nations, we heard before about the Secretary General's agenda for disarmament. There is within the UN Secretariat a whole office, the Office for Disarmament Affairs, UNODA, that is focused solely on disarmament. There's also a UN Institute for Disarmament Research based out of Geneva. And then different of the actual political bodies are also focused on disarmament work. And particularly the UN General Assembly First Committee, they are completely focused on weapons issues, and they meet every year in October for about 4 weeks. And that's sort of the starting point for any UN resolutions on disarmament issues, usually emerge in that time and from that body. Operators and humanitarian actors, especially doing things like clearance and stockpile security. Very important then, civil society, including survivors and victims. I think civil society, it's been an interesting journey for civil society working in disarmament, especially internationally. It's sort of always been like an issue area that is maybe a bit hostile and a bit closed to NGOs in ways that other topics may not have been, but that's really, really been transforming a lot over time. And I think a lot of it really began with the success of the international campaign to ban landmines. And since then, a lot of other civil society actors, and it can really be everybody from advocacy groups to researchers, including academics, to people with technical backgrounds or legal backgrounds, but there's definitely been sort of a thing in the disarmament space of working together across and in coalitions. And if you bring up the next slide, I've put some logos on there just to show you these. I don't even know if this is all of them, but we have like a lot of different international campaigns working in the disarmament space. Campaign to ban landmines, the Cluster Munition Coalition, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, Control Arms and the Arms Trade Treaty, the International Network on Explosive Weapons. And this has been a really, really excellent way of working for our community. I think it's really enabled people to be connected with activists and actors working to advance the same goals in other countries and other locations. Definitely it's helped with the international work when you're in the UN and you want to maybe check something that a delegate has said with the civil society in their country. And also just because we do bring such diverse skills and expertise and we work together in coalition, the outcomes can be really powerful. And all of these different campaigns and networks and coalitions, however they describe themselves, they all take as their starting point to this work a concept called humanitarian disarmament. And what this really means, and it's not too far, I think, from a feminist approach to disarmament, is putting people first. It's people-centric disarmament. And this notion kind of comes from a long history of when disarmament was just being talked about by governments and by militaries in very like hard security and national security terms, you know, thinking purely in terms of like numbers of missiles and things like this, and the rationale of saving lives and protecting people and human security, it really wasn't present in the narrative yet. And then with the campaign to ban landmines, that started to shift over time. And I think that the most recent example would be the work of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and it's really transformative work to shift the narrative on nuclear weapons. And so the humanitarian disarmament community, we all of us NGOs who are part of these different groups, I think we really view ourselves as a community and a community of practice. And every October, usually when the first committee is meeting in New York at the General Assembly, we try to have an annual conference for whomever can join in. And it's been a great way to compare notes, what's happening in your campaign, what's happening in our campaign, how can we work better together, and this sort of thing. So that might be a good segue to the next slide, which is talking a little bit more about WILPF and our approach to disarmament issues. If you are not familiar with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, we are a 106-year-old feminist peace organization, which currently has around maybe 40 staff people based mainly in New York and in Geneva, but there are some outliers like me who are working remotely at the moment from Toronto. And what I've put on the slide here is some text that's taken from the WILPF website, because redefining security is a really good way way to explain the feminist approach that WILPF takes to its work on weapons. You know, in working on disarmament, in working on arms control, what we really are trying to do more broadly is to challenge militarism and its related structures. And so WILPF International has a program for disarmament in which I work. I have two main colleagues. Some of you probably know Ray Atchison. She's been with the program for a long time. And maybe just to give a little bit of history, Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program, was established in 1999. And the feeling from WILPF at the time was that there needed to be sort of a better coordination of civil society input into some of the mostly nuclear weapons related processes happening at the UN at that time, as well as to bring feminist analysis into the room and into the discourse. Over time, the focus has expanded. We do still do a lot of work on nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament, but we also, you know, follow the international arms trade and the ATT, small arms and light weapons. We're part of that process on explosive weapons. We are working on autonomous weapons and increasingly cybersecurity. And we also, as a disarmament program, work very closely with WILPF's human rights team, our women, peace and security team, and as well as are increasingly bringing in other perspectives as well. Next slide. Okay, so actually I might skip this slide. These are just some quotes that I pulled from a report that I thought may be nice, but maybe for time I'll pass it. So of course, cross-cutting in all of our work is a feminist approach to disarmament and bringing gender analysis to these issues. Over the last several years, the idea of gender has become very popular within the disarmament community, both at the policy level, but also practically too. And the reason why I did the air quotes on that is because I think something we have observed is that it's, people are using the word gender sometimes without really being sure exactly what they mean by that. It's being used to describe a variety of different things that might relate to women or to other gender identities and expression, or just to general approaches to disarmament. So it's become a bit of a catch-all, but I think that this is actually a really positive thing, because we're starting to see a lot of gains in this area. There's a lot more interest in thinking about what are the gendered impacts of armed violence, of weapons use. How can things like mine action be done in a way that account for people's experience as a survivor as based on their gender, which relates to their role in their societies and things like this. So the conversation is deepening a lot, and it's kind of an exciting time to be working in this area. But typically what it sort of boils down to is looking at maybe three baskets of things. So first is the idea of participation, gender diverse participation or women's participation in disarmament. Probably no surprise, this is a very male dominated field. And so one of the big goals has just been to change who's at the table, because of course we're all bringing different things to the table, and being able to diversify that table has helped a lot in bringing a more human, people-centric approach to disarmament, raising up questions and concerns that may not have been there before. A second area of work would be around understanding the gender differentiated impacts of weapons, armed violence, and conflict. I think within this has been a heavy interest in preventing gender-based violence as caused by weapons or as related to weapons. And then finally, and this is maybe an area of work where I think WILPF may go a little bit stronger than some other organizations are comfortable with, or other actors, but really kind of taking the step back and saying that we can keep disarming and sort of, trying to trade weapons more safely. But what we really need to do is just challenge the bigger structure. We need to challenge the militarism, the structural violence, the problematic gender norms, and the militarized masculinities that kind of lead to weapons proliferation, lead to weapons development in the first place. So that's sort of a stream of work that we've been doing a lot through research and advocacy. I feel like it's maybe not got kind of the same traction and energy as some of these other areas of work do, but certainly it's something that we have been trying to push from the very beginning, and that very much is at the root of all of our work. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, actually, we can skip this one too. Okay, so yeah, so I just want to now end on some different examples of what all of this looks like practically. One of our major areas of work in reaching critical will is participating in different UN and other international disarmament meetings. And we do a lot of reporting and monitoring and analyzing what is being said in the room. And so part of this, of course, is that we have a really great foot in the door to do advocacy with governments at those places. And we do this through some of our own writing and what we put out in the conference room, also through bilateral meetings and social media as well. And so on this slide, kind of per what I was just saying about how there's been this great increase in interest in gender and disarmament, this slide's actually a little bit out of date now, but I couldn't find a more recent image. But in the first committee, which is the Committee on International Security and Disarmament that I was mentioning before, every year I would say it passes around 60 resolutions that have to do with disarmament. And if you look back in 2015, there's 50 there. Only 7 of those resolutions had a gender reference of some kind. And quite likely, a lot of those references were probably just referring to the protection of women and children. They weren't really mandating any action. They weren't taking a more nuanced view of gender. And you can see how just in those 3 years, the total number of resolutions with a gender reference grew quite a lot. And I actually think that in 2020, There are probably even a few more than that. And coming up on this session, we're expecting to at least maintain this as a baseline and see if we can get more. Next slide, please. Okay, and then so some of the other concrete things that we've done is to try to have recognition of the gendered impacts of weapons, as well as proactive action included in different of the legal instruments that exist on weapons issues. So way back in 2013, when the Arms Trade Treaty was negotiated, there was a big push that WILPF and Amnesty and some other organizations were especially engaged in, and that was to ensure that there was a provision on gender-based violence prevention included in the Arms Trade Treaty. What the Arms Trade Treaty does is it obligates states parties to do a risk assessment process prior to authorizing the transfer of any weapons, any conventional weapons. And so there's sort of like a list of things that they need to check against before they can authorize it to go ahead. And gender-based violence is on that list, which is really a breakthrough thing to have this featured so prominently in an international arms control agreement. There's been a lot of work done since then to try to help states parties understand, like, how do we assess for the risk of gender-based violence? Is it all forms of gender-based violence? What are reputable sources to go to for this kind of thing? So it's been a lot of work since 2013 to see states parties implement this well. But I think it's definitely very much a concrete win to have it in the treaty. And then similarly in 2017, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it also includes recognition in its preamble of the gendered impacts of nuclear weapons, and especially ionizing radiation, and also calls for strengthened participation of women in disarmament and in nuclear disarmament specifically. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I've just put sort of an assortment of images that I think demonstrate some of the work that WILPF International, like us in Reaching Critical Will, that we do with our national sections and groups around the world. We've got, I think, around 40 national sections right now, and there is a Canadian section that I can speak more about shortly. But we're always in contact and collaborating a lot with our colleagues on the ground. We want to hear what they're doing in a national context to advance disarmament, how we can bring that into the UN meetings, how we can bring those people into the UN meetings, et cetera. So just to throw up a couple of recent examples here, the image on the left is the report cover. It was a report that we worked on in Reaching Critical Will with our colleagues in the Middle East North Africa program and an organization in Iraq. And it was looking at the correlation between the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, and specifically firearms, and how there was also a rise in violence against women. They did a lot of field research. It was very difficult to get the information that they did, but they put the report out early this year, and we've been using it in different of our advocacy objectives and work around the UN. We've also had many of our sections in Africa collaborate with another, it's called the Gender Equality Network for Small Arms Control, GENSAC. They did a lot of work earlier this year to raise awareness about gender-based violence, small arms and light weapons, et cetera. So that's an image, I think, from our colleagues in Cameroon. And then we've also been doing a little bit of small granting over the last year. And in 2020, the grants that were distributed helped WILPF national sections research military spending and militarism in their national contexts. And when all of those reports finally came in, they were just so amazing and they had so much good information that we put together a webinar where they could discuss their results and exchange amongst themselves. And it's called Breaking Through the Addiction to Weapons. Next slide, please. I'm almost done, I promise. So this is something that I thought might be useful to all of you, especially if you are also embarking on work on disarmament and gender. This is a screenshot of the Reaching Critical Will website. Last year, or maybe it was late 2019, we launched a new database on the website for gender and disarmament. It's pretty comprehensive. Of course, we're always adding to it, but it has resources in multiple languages. everything from magazine articles to academic journal articles to podcasts, interviews, conference, UN reports. We tried to be very sweeping in putting together everything that we wanted to include in it, and are always updating it. So if anybody listening in right now wants to send something our way, we'd be happy to feature it there. And then last slide. These are also screenshots from our website. And I just kind of put them up there because I wanted to sort of show the breadth of research work that we do in reaching critical will as well, and to flag it up as what would hopefully be a helpful resource for your work on disarmament also. The picture on the left outlines kind of how we organize our research and advocacy, whereas the picture on the right is sort of a screenshot of our publications page, just to sort of give an example of some of the things that we're doing. So I think I will stop there. I'm sorry, I feel like I've spoken maybe for longer than was planned, but hopefully it was interesting for you.
Allison, that was
so much.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Taylor.
Oh, just thank you. That was fascinating.
Yeah, that I was just about to say the same thing. That was a wonderful presentation. So thank you for putting that together. I'd like to open it up now to anybody that has any questions for Allison or the work that she's done. Please feel free to unmute yourself, put on your video to ask the question, or you can also put it in the chat as well. I know I have a few questions if people are a little bit shy right now to start us off, but I'm going to open it up to others right now. Okay, I see Taylor, your hand is up.
Hi, yeah, sorry. Allison, I was just really curious about the Canadian chapter and your role within it, and just basically how you're structured in Toronto.
So I can't remember how long. So we have WILP sections, as I mentioned, in around 40 countries, and Canada is one of them. I've actually gotten to know them all the members, a lot better. I was living in New York for a long time, then I moved back here about 2 years ago, and I've sort of been getting more and more brought into their monthly meetings. I don't think that they work exclusively on disarmament. I think they have other interests as well. A lot of them, I think, are also working in a voluntary and part-time capacity, so they don't necessarily have sort of full-time staff and support, but are definitely very interested in the disarmament work and have been doing a lot, I think, to support that. Earlier in the year, we did a webinar on Canada's feminist foreign policy process, reality, or rhetoric. They also did some contributions in writing to that consultative part of the FFP process as well. And I think that there'll be some research coming out from them later this year, looking at the environmental impacts of militarism, specifically in Canada. And they're based across the country.
Okay, thank you for the question, Taylor. Anybody else have any questions for Allison? I know I was very interested in the report from the grant that you made. Where can we see breaking through the addiction of weapons?
It would be on the WILP YouTube.
Okay.
I can find the link and send it over. Yeah.
Free access? Okay, I was wondering if we had to register for a specific viewing time, but that's wonderful. Okay, I can find that as well. And maybe if I can jump in and give you another question. I just wanted to get your thoughts on, recently the billionaires going to space and the space race, and about the potential for the weaponization of space and for territory, and just the dangers that might come from having territory wars in space. What do you think about that?
I think it's one more thing to keep us up at night. But I would actually, I kind of feel this way, and I would say that others in WILP do too, that this is sort of a risk in a lot of other things right now. Like, for example, in our work on cybersecurity, we've been highlighting the militarization of technology and the weaponization of technology. These are mediums and tools that don't necessarily need to be violent spaces or used in acts of violence, but we're seeing more and more that they're doing so. And I don't think that outer space is a far cry from that. But I would actually, if you're very interested in that, I would refer you to Jessica West at Project Plowshares. This is definitely her area of expertise. She's done lots of research and writing on it, also following kind of the international outer space processes as well.
Thank you. Janice, I see your hand up.
Yeah. Hi, Allison. Boy, I wish we had a dozen of you, at least. You're so knowledgeable and so articulate. I was wondering if you or other members of WILF ever attempt to sort of burrow inside the military academy and have such frank and informative discussions with military personnel. You're getting a wonderful reception here, of course, but I know as Voice of Women members, we don't have particularly don't have such inside opportunities, except when we go to the UN and visit the Canadian office to the UN. There's often a military attaché that's sitting in on the meetings, but I'm meaning something more concentrated and more, well, pushing advocacy. Maybe that's not the right strategy, but anyway, my question relates to this military dimension and our possible ways to influence it.
No, it's a great question, because I think, there is a risk that maybe we're speaking a lot to like-minded and to allies, and where we need to make headway and really speak to our people who see things quite differently. As an organization, or at least in the International Secretariat, we do not engage closely with military officers in our work, but it does happen informally, because as you noted, a lot of delegations to the UN, especially when they're going for a meeting that has to do with weapons, they're going to bring a military advisor as part of their team. So sometimes if we're sitting down with a country and their delegation, of course, we're getting into a conversation with them as well. And some of the international campaigns and networks that we're part of, other NGOs in those networks maybe do work more directly with militaries and try to get their perspective on what we're doing. And it's been interesting, because in some cases, I think it's about trying to do advocacy with them as a sort of a target of the advocacy. But I think in other instances, it's been about trying to understand the issue better. How does the weapon in question work, or how would it work? This has been coming up a lot in the talks on autonomous weapons, which would be weapons that have the autonomy to take life and death decisions on their own. There wouldn't be a human operator. And because it's sort of like cutting edge stuff, it's been an interesting conversation when you hear the militaries come in and explain how autonomy is already present in weapons or is not, and what they see the risks are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions, any things that have come up? Maybe something was unclear, or you'd like to learn more about something? Feel free to ask your question now.
Maybe I could just build a little bit on what I said earlier to Taylor about WILF Canada and the work that we've been doing, I've also been doing a little bit of work, I guess, with my WILPF International hat on since I've been living back here. And I think there's a lot of really good stuff going on right now. I think there's a lot of good advocacy happening, including the work that you're doing on disarmament in Canada and really pushing the government to become more clear in what its goals and objectives are. I've been part of an informal, or WILPF has been part of an informal working group very focused on the Saudi arms deal and ending that. And you know, it's interesting because sometimes it feels like we have great momentum. We'll get a lot of like media pickup. We'll put out an open letter. We'll get a lot of signatures on it, get a lot of press, but we're not really yet seeing the results that we want to. But I feel like there is good momentum and energy in that. And then also the feminist foreign policy development process was very interesting to be part of, and to try to get as much input as possible from Canadians, you know, on what they think a feminist foreign policy ought to include.
Janice, did I see your hand up?
No, I was just giving her thumbs up.
Oh, thumbs up. Allison, I don't know if you can share any secrets, but is WILPF Canada doing anything around the election right now? I know the Canada Saudi arms deal is a big topic for a lot of us here and in the Canada wide Peace and Justice Network. But any plans for actions around you know, holding politicians or candidates running to task about that particular deal?
Not coming out of WILPF directly. I think there are things sort of evolving from the different informal working groups that are following these things. I think there's some concern that with such a short election timeline, it's really hard to prepare adequately and make these the issues that they ought to be. I think there's also been some thinking about what can we do after, and especially with the feminist foreign policy that was being drafted for so long, it hasn't been released. Now we don't know if it will be. Will it get lost if a different party comes in? These kinds of things.
Yes, that's a very good point. We also contributed to that as well, and we are still waiting and wondering if a foreign policy will come down and whether it will be in our minds as feminists as we hope it will be. So we are waiting for that. Hopefully it won't get lost. Yes, exactly. In the election. Okay, so I know we did start a little bit early, so we might end a little bit early. If anybody has any questions for Allison, this is your last chance. Maybe something's come up when we've been talking. So the floor is open, but if not, we might end our session a little bit early. And I want to thank you so much, Allison, for such a wonderful, wonderful presentation and being with us here today to round out our formal sessions. And I would like to tell everyone that we will have more of an informal session following this at 7 o'clock. If you'd like to stick around, a drink of your choice, and we will start our drinks and disarmament session. So feel free to stick around, and thank you so much.